Thanks, Nancy. 10:05 here on a Tuesday morning. Time for the Waterbury Observer Hour. Dublin up today. Editor and publisher John Murray and Bob Muldoon here until noon.
Thank you, Chris. Happy New Year to WATR listeners. It's been a while. Bob and I are going to be spending a couple hours discussing the murders in Campville and the unfolding more than 3 decades we've been involved in this story. And I just want to start off by reading a quote from Julie Brown from the Miami Herald. And she's the reporter who broke the story about Jeffrey Epstein's sex ring. And her quote is really, I think, applicable to journalism all across the world. And she wrote, what I tried to do was to keep hounding away at the story. I didn't give up on it. It's sometimes easy to walk away and just let things happen. But I just felt that I had to keep pursuing it and not let the law enforcement people, the people in government, forget. I think the hardest part sometimes of an investigation is to keep going at it, to keep pecking away at it. And so with that, I'll introduce a driving force behind the Campville reporting, this journalist Robert Muldoon from Boston. So welcome back to the show, Bob.
Thank you, John. It's always great for me to come down to Waterbury. I really have grown to be fond of this place.
Well, that's great. So I think, Bob, one of the very first tenets of journalism, you can't assume that anyone has heard your shows before or read your stories before, and so it's always about resetting things. So we do have some groundbreaking information that we've developed that we're going to get to near the end of the segments here, but to just recapture some of this stuff. So if anyone's listening for the first time, this is maybe the 9th or 10th time I've had you on here, but you haven't been on for almost a year, right? And I think in 2022, I think I had you on 9 months of the 12 Observer shows. You just kept coming back down from Boston, and we were really grinding at the story back then. So let's just set the tone and the place about the Campville murders. And so let's go all the way back to 1993. In January of 1993, you were the police reporter at the Register-Citizen newspaper up in Torrington, and I was the head of the photography department, and also working, I had a couple days, or 1 day a week, they'd allow me to work on in-depth documentary projects. And so there was a murder in January. A third body of a sex worker was found in the Campville section of Harwington. And so Harwington was right in the circulation area of the Register-Citizen. And so Waterbury wasn't. These were Waterbury women that were being murdered and dumped in Harwington. But I came down to your desk, you're the police reporter, and suggested that we work on a project about looking into what's going on here. And so we talked about it a little bit, about us going down into the streets of Waterbury, and I lived in Waterbury then, to talk to the sex workers and do some on-the-ground reporting and interviewing and documentation of the lives of the sex workers and how this was impacting them, or were they fearful? And so what do you recall about me coming down to your desk?
Well, I had only been at the paper for 2 months, and I was not native to Torrington or Waterbury. I was from Massachusetts. So when a third woman, her name was Evelyn Betancourt, was found by the Naugatuck River in Campville, I didn't have much of a perspective on what was going on. But you knew instantly what is happening here? This is a third woman. Is there a serial killer? So you said we have to go out there, and these women you knew were being picked up on Grove Street in Waterbury. I didn't know that. You said we have to go to Grove Street and see what's going on. Are these women going to still be out there on Grove Street after a third body has been found there? Because we went out there 2 days after Evelyn Betancourt. Previously, there had been, in late 88, Karen Everett had been a Waterbury sex worker. Her body had been found on, rolled down a hill in Campville. A couple months after that, 96 days later, a woman named Mildred Alvarado, who had been was a sex worker working on Grove Street, was found 5 feet from where Karen Everett's body was, and then soon after that, a few years later, Evelyn Betancourt. So you said we have to go out and see what's going on there. Are women still going to be working out there with 3 bodies now and a possible serial killer? So I was a little frightened. I didn't necessarily want to go out in an area where a serial killer was on the loose and not found and be in the midst of that. And I remember thinking in my own mind, well, I don't even have health insurance with this newspaper that I just started with, So I was a little fearful of that. Are we going to get hurt? I'm not even, I don't have insurance. But we went, we had to go, and you made the case, and it was, I knew we had to go. But when we went there, what we found was astounding, I would say. We ended up talking to about 4 or 5 different women, and they were still out there, even though 2 nights earlier a third woman had been picked up from those very streets and murdered and dumped in Campville. And in the air police had told them to be wary of a white man in a van. There was not a lot of information, but there was sort of this boogeyman out there. There's a white man in a van who's...
Not a boogeyman, a killer.
A killer. And the women mostly talked to us,
but they didn't give us their names. They were giving us aliases, and as we were talking, it really, we started learning stuff about why they were out there, and it was drug addiction, and it was something I'd never even heard of. It was P-dope that they were after, and so a
synthetic heroin.
So the power of that drug had just taken over their lives and upended their lives.
And crack cocaine was also big in that era too.
Yeah, and so we had a couple of quick interactions, no photographs. They didn't want to be photographed, I think, at first. And then we met one memorable young woman. Why don't you tell the listeners about that encounter?
Yeah. Other women would acknowledge they were addicted to drugs, and that's why they were out there. And while they were fearful of being killed and a killer not apprehended, such was their addiction that they were willing to throw caution to the wind, or they had to. But they wouldn't give us. They would tell us a little bit about their story, but they wouldn't give their name. Wouldn't allow us to take a photo. But we met one woman who was quite different. She told us her name. Her name was Frederica Spinola. She told us a little bit about her life. She had an 8-year-old daughter who she loved, but she also told us she was very addicted to P-dope, which I guess is a synthetic heroin that was injected, and also crack cocaine. And so she had to be out there feeding that habit, and she did it like the other women, excuse me, by turning tricks, and they admitted it. But Rika was forthcoming, very forthcoming. She allowed you to take a photo, which, she was just open to us. She trusted us.
There was we hung out on the corner with her for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and she was very open, and she was making eye contact with all kinds of cars going by. She was working the streets as she was talking to us. I'm sure we were driving business away at that moment. But at one point I was talking to her about the impact or the fear of working the streets when 3 of her fellow sex workers along that street had been murdered.
And she knew some of them.
Yeah, and I asked her a very direct question. I said, I looked her right in the eyes and told her, if I told you I was the killer and I offered you $20, would you come in the car with me? And she looked at me and said, yes. She goes, you don't look like no killer. But it was the Russian roulette of that lifestyle that she was trying to just look at somebody and see if, judge if it was worth getting in the vehicle with them. But more than the fear, more than the potential consequences of being killed was the pull of that next hit. She needed that $20, and she was going to do anything for that $20, including risking her life. And she was risking her life every time she went on that street, every time she climbed in a van or a car or went off in the bushes with somebody. She was risking her life, and all those women were. And so that was a revelation to both of us to see that there was the sex was just it was a means to an end. It wasn't even so they're paying their rent or paying for it. Was all about drugs that brought them onto the street, and we were both really surprised by that, I think.
And we witnessed them, John, leave a car, and then they would walk directly to, there was this old abandoned house that looked like the Addams Family house that was on a hill right around Grove Street, and we would see them leave the car and beeline it right up to that house, and then they told us that's where the dealer was, that was the crack house, the P-dope house. So they got the money, and there was no dawdling. They immediately got the fix, and then we even saw them come back down. I mean, it doesn't take a long time to have a few hits of crack cocaine or to shoot up. 10 minutes later, we'd see them back down. So they're chasing the addiction, getting the money and going right to the drug source.
So I just want to reset here. So I'm John Murray from the Waterbury Observer, and this is the Waterbury Observer News Hour. It's every month, the first Tuesday of the month that we do a radio show, and I'm with Bob Muldoon, and we're talking about Campville Murders. There's been 6 women that have been found murdered up in Campville, and so we've gotten involved in investigation, but our original encounter with this story was when we both worked at another newspaper more than 3 decades ago. And so we started working on the project. We had interviews, we had photographs. You started writing your stuff up. I printed some photographs up, and then you were having some collisions with the editors there. You were new, and you had a master's degree from Columbia. You're highly intelligent, trying to figure your way out, how to be a small town crime reporter. And I remember you telling me, it's like we were working on this big project, which was simply by far and away the most significant thing that was happening at the paper then, but we had no support. They wanted you, the planning and zoning meetings, the science fair, the what was going, like that was the bread and butter of a daily newspaper, the nuances of day-to-day life, and we were after some big major league thing that didn't resonate with the editors who needed that quick stuff that they could put into the paper the next day. And so you were having collisions with the editors, and I think it was when was it? April of 1993. So we're a couple months into our project. We're getting ready to offer it up to the editors, and I come into the paper and Bob's gone. He's left, and he's headed back to Boston, or headed back to Hartford, I think was where you were going. But you're out of the paper, and I was like, oh, that was kind of shocking. But you just were colliding with the mentality of the local editors, and so a few months after that, I left to start the Waterbury Observer with Marty Begnell, and our story of the sex workers in Waterbury and being dumped up there in the Campville section. Just went cold. It never got published. You ended up back in Massachusetts and started another career, left journalism, disgusted with what you'd encountered. And I tried to recruit you a couple times. You don't remember this, but I tried to recruit you to come to the Waterbury Observer in the 90s to get you to come back. And I always saw that you had some really great potential to be a crackerjack journalist. You just needed some guidance, and you didn't get that. And so years go by. I keep trudging away with the Waterbury Observer, and I stopped and pondered a little bit, is like, why didn't I immediately think about continuing that story? As soon as I started the Waterbury Observer in October of 1993, and quite frankly, as it was so overwhelmed, like starting a newspaper with Marty, of selling ads and dealing with the rough and tumble politics of Waterbury, and it didn't even cross my mind, because at that point you were the reporter and I was the photographer, and the story was gone. I didn't have the notes, I didn't have the interviews. I'd have to go out and redo the whole thing all over again. And for whatever reason, it's the Observer chugged along, and we got to April 2020, so almost 4 years ago, the world shut down in quarantine, and you find yourself quarantined in your apartment in Boston. And take the listeners through, what you uncovered.
So that was 27 years later. I had left journalism. I was working in Boston for a software company. And my company, like the whole world, in March of 2020, went work from home. Everyone was working from home. So I'm in my apartment in Boston and working from home, so I have a lot more free time. I don't have to commute in the morning, I don't have to commute in the afternoon, so I'm organizing, going through some old folders I had. I kept them in boxes and trying to organize things, and I come across a frayed folder that said Waterbury on it, and I perked up a little, pulled it out, and opened it, and to my surprise, to my shock, it had all the notes from that night in January 1993, 2 days after the third Campville murder, where John and I had gone on the streets. All the notes were there. Not only that, but the story was 99% written. It was on the old news type that we used at the Register Citizen back then. It was pretty much done, but it was never printed because, and
it was hiding in a box.
It was hiding in that box. So I was shocked to find it. I hadn't thought too much about it over the year. I mean, that night was very, very vivid. That experience was very, very vivid, but I had, I hadn't dwelled on it much. But to find it brought me right back to the streets of Waterbury that night, talking to Rika with John there, and just all the vivid sensory experience came back. And John and I had kept in touch over the years, so this is 27 years later, mostly through Facebook and occasional meetings, maybe once or twice over those years. But we were in touch by texting and Facebook. I sent John immediately, I sent him a photo of some of the contents that were in that folder. And I said, John, look what I just found. You're not going to believe this. And I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so the photographs that I took of Frederica Spinola, I didn't know her name because you had taken the name with you in your box, and so I just knew I had a photograph, this powerful photograph of a sex worker on Grove Street with cars whizzing by, blurry in the background. Excuse me. And I had printed that photograph in several years later and exhibited it in a photojournalism exhibit that I had at the University of Connecticut, and I had just described her as a sex worker in Waterbury.
Now, John, when you took the photo, there was no digital. There was basically no internet. You took it in an old-fashioned camera.
Yeah. So, but I had taken that negative and I had printed it. So it was a 11 by 14 print that was actually framed and had been showcased at the University of Connecticut. And I had that framed photograph upstairs in my own boxes. And I'd had to, in downtown Waterbury, when Post University took over the Howland Hughes space, I'd had an office underneath Howland Hughes for several years, and so I had to vacate. So I just recently I had taken all the boxes out of the Observer office on Bank Street, and I had shoved them into a bedroom in my house. There's like dozens and dozens of boxes, and I had just seen that photograph, and so I went upstairs and I took a picture of that and sent it to you. And it was like, so now you had the name and I had the photograph, and then we started talking and you started Googling, and so it gets a little dramatic here. And so I think we're going to take a quick break right now just to get back to, this is John Murray from the Waterbury Observer. I'm talking to journalist Bob Muldoon about the Campville murders, and we'll get back to this in just a moment. Thank you, Chris. So this is John Murray from the Waterbury Observer. I'm sitting here with Bob Muldoon. We're talking about the Campville murders. And so we had worked on this story in 1993, not had it published. Our lives went different ways. You get out of journalism. I start the Waterbury Observer. Literally 27 years, the story that we were collaborating on about the Campville murders was unpublished, sitting in a box in your apartment in Boston. We reconnect, and this photograph, as I sent you this photograph of Rika, she's standing on Grove Street with a car whizzing past. And so right after that, so now you have her name, and we have the story, and so now this is all coming back to life, and you in your apartment start Googling her name and discover what?
We had met her January 6, 1993. In Googling Frederica Spinola, I discovered that about 18 months later, in 1994, She was in a van. So, quick backtrack. The night we went out, 2 nights after the third body was found, there was not a lot of information on who the killer might have been, but the women on the street were told to be wary of a white man in a van. That's not much. And in doing our reporting, we had contacted state police, and they also said, well, we're looking, there's some indication that there was a white man in the van. In finding out what happened to Rika in 1994, 18 months later, she fell out of a white van going 50 miles an hour on Route 8 within a mile of the Campville exit. She was ejected somehow from this van going 50 miles an hour on Route 8, fell out of the vehicle, was run over by a vehicle behind that, and died. The man driving the van stopped. The vehicle, which turned out to be an Audi, which hit her, did not stop. Fled the scene. Rika, the man in the van who had been driving her, it turned out had picked her up at McDonald's in Waterbury, and was driving her to, he claimed, Torrington, where he was a van driver for a company. He later told police that when she saw an exit sign off of Route 8 that said Campville, that she panicked and jumped from the vehicle. This is what he told police. Whatever happened, he did stop, went to the side of the road. After she was struck by another vehicle, he pulled her off the side of the road, and state police came on the scene and interviewed him. So that's what I learned. And I had a flashback in my notes, and I remembered vividly her saying, when we interviewed her, she had said, "I got me a habit and I'm going to die on these streets." So we don't know exactly what happened to Rika, but that's what I found out. And it was shocking and emotional too.
So this all unfolds within an hour of us connecting the photograph to your reporting. You'd opened up the box, and we find out Frederica's dead, jumping out of a van by Campville. It's like, holy crap. And sirens were going off in our head. And you launched very aggressive Google searches, and we just started digging into the story again. We sent out FOI requests to the Connecticut State Police. We started FOIing Waterbury Police Department about some murders here, trying to just seek information out about the Campville, this series of 3. It turns out those 3 deaths were now 6 deaths, so many decades later, and one as recent as January of 20. Or December of 2021. Yeah, so a recent one. So it had gone from 1988, 1989, in 1993. There was another one in 2004 or 2005, and then to 2022 or 21. So is this all the same person killing? Do we have a serial killer? So we started Googling, researching. You did a deep dive microfilm of the Hartford Courant, the Republican American, news sources, trying to document all these different cases. And it got pretty intense. We were really chugging hard, but we ran into a brick wall trying to get assistance from the police at first. That your initial request of FOI from Robert Muldoon to the Waterbury Police Department, it went into the spokesperson, who then, by procedure, had to reach out to the detective who was assigned some of these murders. And even though it was under the jurisdiction of the Connecticut State Police, there were some of the murders that had taken place in Waterbury, or some of the bodies had been found in Waterbury. So Waterbury was involved with some of this, and Waterbury did collaborate a little bit with the
We learned about jurisdiction, which we maybe didn't know a lot about.
Yeah, and also very significant was the Connecticut State Police and the Waterbury Police back in 1988. In the late 80s, there was a beef between the Connecticut State Police had wiretapped the state's attorney's office in Waterbury, and so had sort of crossed the bounds of, like, it was like authority investigating authority, like Spy versus Spy from Mad Magazine. And there was a beef between the Waterbury cops and the Connecticut State Police. And so when these murders first occurred in Campville, there was not very much collaboration. And we could see that from news articles, there was a great deal of information about the first young lady who was murdered, Karen Everett. The police officers in Waterbury knew her. They knew her very well. But the Connecticut State Police were not collaborating. It was just a wall between the two of them. So it became jurisdictional problems, beef problems with all this stuff. But as we continued on with this investigating, and we published your first story, the first one. We updated a little bit and published it on the Observer website and shared it across the Observer's social media platforms. So it was just online at first and on social media, and we got an electric response from the community with tips. So we got a dozen or more tips, really hardcore tips about specific suspects. We started learning about murders that we knew nothing about, and within a matter of a few months, the 6 deaths, we were up to 19 women that had died in Greater Waterbury from mysterious circumstances, not all in Campville, some along train tracks behind McDonald's, some of them up right on the border of Watertown and Waterbury, right on the
river.
Right on the river. There's in the river was one. So we ended up with 19. Some of those cases were closed. They weren't considered cold cases. They weren't even considered murders. The young lady who was found in the river said it was an accident that she ended up in the river, but she was a sex worker.
Marie Thrasher.
Yeah. So there were we were suddenly overwhelmed by what is going on here. And in the middle of this, we end up with this guy who confessed to murdering a bunch of sex workers. And William Devon Howell, who's the most prolific serial killer in Connecticut history, he was predatory on Waterbury sex workers. He's convicted of in prison for life for killing. So this happened in the early part of this century, like 2004, 2005. So he's involved in all this stuff. So it was a tsunami of information that was coming our way, and I likened it as we just became like a tip jar. It's like people were just sending us private messages, and you ended up reaching out. We started methodically just trying to reach out because Frederica, we're going to name her, we're going to publish her picture, we're going to tell the story, and where was that 8-year-old little girl now? She's in her mid to late 30s. Does she live in Waterbury? We don't want to shock her. She had an ex-husband. So we tried to reach out through our contacts and through connections, trying to track down the ex-husband, find the daughter. I used a lot of connections that I had, and people did manage to find the ex-husband, but he didn't respond to overtures to talk to him. And you eventually found her daughter. And so before we put this big package in print about 19 women and all the stuff that was unfolding, so from April of 2020, when it first erupted, to when we published the story was January of 2021. And then that was online. We started doing shows on WATR radio. We did 9 shows in a year about it. But the spring of 2022, we dropped like a 20-page spread in print of the Observer about everything that we had found. And during that time period, you had found Frederica's daughter and did a very compelling story about her. And you reached out to Karen Everett's family and
Mildred
Alvarado, the first 2 women that were murdered.
Jessica Muscus's family. She was 2000.
So very powerful stuff, going from you quit journalism in 1993, despairing, despondent over the whole thing, and 30 years later, here you are doing some really serious journalism. But some of the hardest stuff you have to do is contacting family members of that have been devastated by murders, and so you went to a whole series of interviewing people, and we published all this stuff. And more information started pouring out. And then we started working closer with the Waterbury Police Department, trying to get the police reports that have to do with anything involving any of these cases we had. There's half of them now were in Waterbury proper. And the original, you sent an information or a request to Waterbury Police Department asking for police records, and so that officer had to reach out to the detective. The detective came back and said it was ongoing investigations and not to release those records, but I ended up going to Chief Spagnola and asked for the records and told him the response. So this has been, some of these things were 20 years old. And when I told him that it had come back and said it's active and ongoing investigation, he literally laughed that was not true. And then he opened the floodgate. And so Waterbury started providing with a lot of information about, there was Elizabeth
Gray Watts,
who was murdered on, what's that building?
69 Linden Street.
Used to be the old welfare thing, and now it's new housing. If you drove by it today, you'd be stunned. Last time we were here, it was still that building, and now that's flattened, and there's big affordable housing in there. So there's so much that happened, and it was. Well, how are you processing all this? Is like you're up in Boston, and now it's just erupted from a story that we're working on in 1993 to that was no longer the story. It had exponentially just gone crazy. So what was going through your head?
Yeah, when we first went out, there had been 3 women who were murdered. They were working on Grove Street as sex workers, and they were picked up there likely, and their bodies ended up in Campville, in Harwinton, near the Naugatuck River, rolled down a small hill. In the meantime, as we started digging deeper and doing research and tips coming in, we came up with a list of like 19 women who died under very suspicious circumstances. Six bodies have been found near Campville, and we're including Frederica Spinola, who we talked about, who was in a van and was ejected from it a mile from Campville. What we learned, but there were other women who, what we learned a little about jurisdiction is, even though these women may have lived in Waterbury, may have been working on Grove Street, it's where the body is located becomes the law enforcement agency that does the investigation. So for the 6 Campville murders, the Connecticut State Police, it was their jurisdiction because that's where the body was found. They may have lived, worked, and been even murdered on the streets of Waterbury, but because they were dumped in Campville, Connecticut State Police, it's their murder investigation. So what you mentioned, John, and what we found is there was a lot of institutional knowledge in Waterbury by the Waterbury Police Department about these women, because a lot of them had been arrested for drugs. Some of them had been arrested for prostitution by Waterbury police. And they knew these women, as beat cops.
Let's just take a quick moment, Bob, and if you could, I just handed you a report that we printed a couple years ago. If you could just read off the names of the women. So it has here 18. So there was another one that emerged on the scene. So just so WATR listeners can get a feel for, and they may know some of these people. And so these are the women that were murdered.
Karen Everett, called Brandy, age 25, 1988. Mildred Alvarado, age 30, January 1989. Marie Thrasher, age 24. Her body was found in 1990 in the Naugatuck River near Bank Street. Mary Jo Markowitz.
I'll pick it up. You just take a deep breath, Bob. It's very emotional for both of us, and Bob is he's very real with his emotions. It's which is actually very powerful. Mary Jo Markowitz, age 34, found in 1992 on railroad tracks on Chase River Road. Evelyn Betancourt, age 27, found on Valley Road in Harwington. This is the Campville section in 1993. Olga Marie Cornelius Ubera. She was found on Waterbury Road, right on the Thomaston Waterbury town line. Frederica Spinola, she was the one that we were referencing before that jumped from a van on Route 8 right as they were entering Campville. Lori Delgado, she was found in Cheshire. Manner of death she was murdered, but that was unsolved. Sean May Haskell, which was found on railroad tracks in 1999. Bernadine Paul is a missing person. It's a cold case in Waterbury. Elizabeth Graywatts was found in 69 Linden Street in 2002. Jessica Marie Muscus, she was 22. She was found in Campville. Melanie Ruth Camellini is missing. Marilyn Gonzalez, 2003. Mary Jane Menard. These were murdered and confessed by by William Devon Howell. So he was 3 of the women so he's a serial killer. He killed 7 women, 3 from Waterbury. So he's not involved with all the cases that we are, but he's confessed and in prison right now for picking up women in Waterbury. He'd sometimes pick them up on Grove Street. One horrific scene was he was living in a van. He picked up a young woman and tied her up and bound her up in the McDonald's parking lot on Thomaston Avenue. He'd keep them in prison for 24 hours, assaulting them and then murdering them. And he buried them in New Britain. There was a sensational case, I guess 6 or 7 years ago, where they found all these bodies buried in New Britain behind a plaza, and 3 of them were Waterbury women, Kelsey Massamaro, and the latest was Brianna Beam, that she was found in Campville in December 2021. So it went from our 3 that when we were first doing this at the Register Citizen to now it's 19.
And John, it's important to note that not all of these women were sex workers. Not all of them were drug addicts. The 19 murders entail different circumstances.
Yes.
So
that's a very good point. And one of the things, though, many of them were sex workers, and many of them were suffering and wrestling with substance abuse problems, which we found that actually not Waterbury or not Connecticut. This is the national problem, that the sex workers are the most vulnerable population, and it's they climb in vans and cars and trucks with complete strangers and go off into wooded areas.
Thanks, Nancy. 11:07 here at WATR. You're listening to a special Waterbury Observer Hour. Into the second hour now. It is John Murray, editor and publisher of the Waterbury Observer, with special guest Bob Muldoon.
Thank you, Chris. Just to continue what we were talking about the last hour, where the Observer has been involved in a pretty intense investigative project started off with murders in Campville and has spread to 19 different murders in Greater Waterbury. Excuse me. And so we published a big package in the spring of 2022, and then we pressed the Connecticut State Police for FOI requests, trying to get the documents because they had jurisdiction over Campville. So the initial requests, we had to pay money, X amount of dollars, wasn't much, a couple $100 for a request. So we put that in, but we didn't really press hard because, truth be told, we were kind of stunned by everything. And from April 2020, we did this hard push, and then we're kind of paralyzed. At least I was paralyzed. I was working on a Smolinski investigation, trying to get a dig done down in the lower Naugatuck Valley, and working intensely with the Waterbury Police Department. So I was firing on a lot of different cylinders, and Bob took up the mantle and was chasing after the FOI stuff. And the original stuff had languished for quite some time, and I think they maybe take us through this, Bob, because I'm a little sketchy. They rejected the first one, didn't they?
Yeah, we requested information on all the Campville murders, 6 different women, and we paid money, a certain amount per case, and we asked for all the police reports for those open cases. They cashed the check immediately. That wasn't a problem. but weeks went by, months went by. We didn't receive anything. We got no notifications. So we contacted them by email.
We went there too, personally.
Yeah, I mean, the different stage. We started escalating it. We went there in person. We didn't really get much that. Oh, they said, well, they needed to see the number on the check. I mean, there were all these. So we didn't have that number. And then so you actually dug the check out, found the number. We sent it. We sent the check number and the bank number, and they said, "Oh yeah, well, we're working on it."
We'll just stop there for a moment. So here's the Connecticut State Police. This is an FOI request, Freedom of Information request. So we put it in under the Waterbury Observer, under Bob Muldoon, under John Murray, and their system. They couldn't find the Waterbury Observer, Bob Muldoon, Campville, John Murray. They could find none of that. So they pushed back and said we had to produce the check that they had cashed, and then they could find the information, that is so crazy right there. But we found it, and then I think they rejected it because we ended up appealing, and we were going to have a hearing. Right?
Yeah, they said, so we started pushing a little harder. We jumped through the hoops, got the check number, and they said, well, first they said, well, we're working on it. And then we called and got a live person, and they sent us from one person to another, and basically they ended up saying they're active investigations and we can't. They're not required. They're required by law under the Freedom of Information Act to respond to the press
or to anybody
or the public. But they would. But if it's an active ongoing investigation, well, they're protected because they need to keep sources confidential in the investigation. So even though these murders, some of the things we were asking for were 1988 with Karen Everett, 1989 with Mildred Alvarado.
They're saying it's ongoing.
Ongoing.
And the family is saying they're calling the Connecticut State Police. They can't get through to anybody. Nobody's calling them back. They've had no contact in a decade. The family members, the daughter, the family of Karen Everett, they're just being stonewalled by the Connecticut State Police, which is doing a horrific job with public relations, and now thwarting us trying to get at the information. They're rejecting our request. So we appealed, and we had a hearing date.
Well, we filed a complaint. So finally, we had enough with all these different obstacles. We filed a formal complaint with the Freedom of Information Board in Hartford. Laid out the case. We went into detail about all these times we've been stonewalled. We got a hearing date set, so the complaint was filed. We had a hearing date set in January of 22. With that,
yes.
You and I were prepared to go to Hartford. John doesn't wear ties, but I think he had a clip on. But we were going to present ourselves before this board and make our case. Well, literally a week, days before, we get a call from an attorney representing the Connecticut State Police. His name was Matthew Reed, who, in our story, is a hero, a bit of a hero to us. He said, we'll get you this information if you... He didn't ask us to withdraw the complaint. He said, if you put it on hold, if you...
I think he did ask us to go away, and he would make good. And I said, we'll postpone it, but we're not going away. We're going to leave that paperwork there, because he had to show us something, because he was asking us just to let the complaint go, and so he didn't want that going to a hearing. And so he then started helping.
So we postponed it. We both agreed we'll postpone it. And if he said, if I produce the documents, maybe ultimately you'll withdraw it.
Yes, and thus began. It started as a trickle and ultimately ended up as like a fire hose of information. As it turns out, all these reports that we were asking for are hard copies in boxes, and they needed to be digitized and updated. So it wasn't a cold case; it was a frozen case. All this stuff, even the listings in the Connecticut State Police website for Karen Everett and Mildred Alvarado, they had the two of them just lumped together as one crime. No photographs of them. Photographs of all the other cold case people. That here's their picture and information. So we found photographs of both women, and I believe we shared it with them. And I think even to this day it hasn't been updated. So which is a disrespect. Is like if you have a website dedicated to cold cases for the public to look at and for law enforcement to look at and not have any real information, and to put two people together as they're the same is fairly insensitive. But Attorney Reed did start going through stuff, and so he went to records and to the Western Major District Crime Squad that had to start creating these reports, and we ultimately ended up meeting with Sergeant Hazen from the Western District Crime Squad that said that it was ultimately his decision whether to release these things or not, and he decided to release them. But what had to happen is they're understaffed, and they had to take some of the men and women and work overtime to digitize these things. So you're taking detectives from the state police are now working overtime to digitize this stuff. And when the spigot / fire hose finally stopped coming, there was 3,000 documents that ended up in a portal for and Bob's the one who went through it. So take WATR listeners through a little bit, Bob, and just to reset again, anyone who's just tuning in, this is John Murray from the Waterbury Observer, talking to journalist Bob Muldoon about an Observer investigative project into Campville Murders that led to discovery of 19 murders in Greater Waterbury that we were questioning and probing around. And so now the documents that were coming to you, how did you process? How did you dig through this? And how seems rather overwhelming.
Yeah, as you mentioned, these were in boxes in the evidence room of the Western District Major Crime Squad. At least some of these records were. So they had to scan all of those documents. And we were asking about 7 cases, I think. Each of those cases, I would say, had over 1,000 pages of reports. Now, these reports were, witnesses that they had interviewed, evidence collected at the crime scene, photographs, prior arrest records.
Did it come in a sequence? Was it in order, or was it like a deck of cards just thrown at you?
It was, so each case, each woman, it would come in, there was some loose arrangement. They were in folders, so there might have been witness testimony might have been a folder. So anyone they did an interview of, they would have scanned all those interviews that were, it had originally been written by hand by the police and then typed up by some secretary, and then scanned. And so So, and then crime scene evidence might have been a folder. So they were kind of loosely organized. I believe as the police who were scanning them would take it out, scan it, and then they'd have to, put it into some folder. So it wasn't. It was roughly organized, I would say, but there literally were thousands, because then there would be autopsy reports. There would be suspect reports. There would be surveillance done, so the police would go to Campville like the day or two after and take every license plate down of anyone that drove by. So there were all these different pieces of the investigation. Some of it, I seemed very irrelevant to me. And I'm not a police investigator, but they take in thousands, in tips. They take in thousands of pieces of information, and then they bundle it all up for us. So yeah, it was overwhelming. I mean, it wasn't presented sequentially. So it was trying to piece together a story that was kind of coming at us not in a chronological order or not in any hierarchical form, just kind of all over the place, and then trying to make a narrative in my own mind out of it, in our mind, to figure it out. So yeah, puzzle pieces and putting it together.
Well, that's a good way to put it, puzzle pieces, because really what we're trying to do is take some of the information that was discovered in news accounts in real time when these crimes took place. There was statements made, quotes made, and you dug out a lot of this stuff through microfilm. There were these tips that came to us were pieces of the puzzle, and now the police reports from Waterbury, the police reports from the Connecticut State Police, and tried to put this stuff together. And as we started to go through this, there was several aha moments that when you were first digging into the published stories of particularly Karen Everett, when you were researching her murder and reading the media accounts, it was pretty shocking. Some of the stuff that certain individuals were, a certain individual was the main source of all this information in Karen Everett's murder, and it was her employer, her landlord. He was speaking of her in glowing references, and at one point that you reached out to me and said, it's crazy, like this guy's just gushing all this information out, and it was making you feel your spidey sense was tingling a little bit. This is like too much information. And as looking through, when we started to get police reports, that there started to be a lot of suspicion built up around this one particular suspect. And I received a call from a highly credible person in Waterbury who gave us a tip and said, I know who killed Karen Everett, and then said this person's name to me. And so now you're already getting very suspicious. We get a tip from somebody that this guy is he's perhaps the serial killer, and which doesn't make it true. Or like now it's just getting really our heightened awareness about what's going on, what's transcribing before our eyes, and then going through police reports, you find out a lot more information about this man, and you made phone calls and got more information, and there's a lot of stuff that started to dig up, and just as the publisher and editor of the Waterbury Observer, there's several times where I've had to clip things out of Bob's stories because Bob gets overzealous and just wants to say, this is the guy. He did it. And I said, no, you can't do that, Bob. It's like, we don't know that yet. There's a lot of very curious circumstances with this man. And so as we're digging through stuff, you found out some very interesting things that because you already had this guy as a potential murderer, and now you discover stuff when you're going through the police reports. And so tell the WATR listeners what you found.
Well, as you mentioned, he first came on our radar when we were looking at microfilm of the Karen Everett murder in 1988. He was interviewed by police. He was Karen Everett's landlord and employer. And the papers called him such. But he was extremely effusive in his praise for her. He knew all about her personal life, her childhood. He was the lead authority on Karen Everett's life, more so than her father, who was also interviewed in the story. So it seemed a little odd that stuck out. We later found out that in 2002, the same man was the landlord and employer of another sex worker who was murdered in Waterbury, Elizabeth Gray Watts. This man had a similar, seemed like, relationship, a landlord and employer of a woman. Both of these women had drug arrests and prostitution arrests. So when we saw that, and we weren't even aware of Elizabeth Gray Watts' murder in 2002. We got a tip, and then this man's name and came. In both cases, he was the first one to identify the body and call the police. So on top of his being like overly helpful to the press, and now to see another woman that he had been the first one to identify, another sex worker from Waterbury, first to identify, first to call police on it. It really got us supercharged.
And he ends up, through the police report, it ends up that he's in full-blown sexual relations with these women. So he's setting them up in an apartment. They're working for him. He's setting them up, and he's getting sexual favors from them. He's married. He's multiple reports. He's like a serious philanderer with the sex workers. This is his appetite and his preference for decades, and so that he's now and then he's appearing in media reports as almost like, priestly reminiscing about these fallen angels, and
he's helping them. The story he's telling is, I thought she was coming along real well. I was paying for her methadone. I was teaching her. She wanted to go to college. So this guardian angel, chief mourner. I mean, he takes on multiple roles. This, a helper is the way he's portraying himself in the media.
So we're going to keep exploring this particular angle that ends up being a little bit of a blockbuster that Bob discovered. In just a minute, we're going to take a break. This is John Murray from the Waterbury Observer interviewing Bob Muldoon about the Campville murders, and we'll be back in just a minute. Thank you, Chris. This is John Murray for the Waterbury Observer. I'm talking with Bob Muldoon about Campville Murders, and it's an ongoing project at the Observer. And as we were really compiling information from the Waterbury Police Department, the Connecticut State Police, microfilm stories from the Hartford Courant, the Republican American, tips that we had, interviews that Bob had conducted, as we really started to zero in on this one particular man for the first murder of this whole series, is the murder of Karen Everett. And so we were talking about that he was the landlord, he was her employer. Elaborate a little bit more about this relationship, because the police reports show that he was in a clear sexual relationship with her, and he had been in a similar situation with at least two other women that we know of, that's documented, that they were sex workers, and he would put them up in an apartment, pay them stipends, and expected sex on his every whim. And so you used a term to describe the situation moments ago off the air. Why don't you pick it up from...
Yeah, they were kind of captive sex slaves. Karen Everett was in jail in early 1988 and was released in June of 1988. While she was in prison, this man was sending money to her prison account. He sent 4 checks for $50 each, and we have this as part of the evidence file. So he was grooming her at that point. He had some kind of relationship before she went to prison in late '87. It turned out before she went to prison, she introduced him to another sex worker who we ended up interviewing this year. And while Karen Everett was in prison, he had another woman, a sex worker, who he gave an apartment to and expected sex as part of that exchange.
And the apartment is right above his business.
Yep. So when Karen Everett came out of jail in June of 1988, he moved her into an apartment above his business, put her on a salary, $180 a week, and now mind you, this was 1988. Gave her, shortly thereafter, bought her a car, a blue Dodge Charger. Gave her a credit card for gas. Phone. Adding up all the money that he spent on her over the course of 6 months, it was $10,000 about in 1988 money, which would be $23,000 or so now.
And with all this power and control that he had over her life, she started, and through some of the interviews you've done and some of the police reports, it's believed that she was stealing money from him as well. And probably most inflammatory to him is that she was continuing to see other people, and so it wasn't an exclusive. Even though he's taking care of her, he wanted her all to himself. She's seen other people that made him quite irate. So all this, there's this other darker thing behind the mask of this goodwill guy saying all these positive things about her, and he's reaching out to the media to try and control the narrative. And all across our reporting about sex workers and murders and looking at state and national information is that law enforcement is quick to look the other way about the Johns. They're very protective. It's males in power a lot that the police have kind of not gone after the Johns, and we found that in Frederica Spinola when she jumped out of that van and was hit and killed, is that it seems like the state police dealt with the driver of the van that she jumped out driving towards Campville. They didn't really treat him as a suspect. It seems like he was a 70-something-year-old Boy Scout leader, church guy from Newtown, and a former constable in Newtown. And so this guy, Albert Boyson, gave statements to the state police, but he was back driving the van the next day, and it seemed like the whole thing was just an accident that she jumped out. And it doesn't seem like anyone really asked the question is, what is she doing in that van with you, Mr. Boyson? And where are you going with her? And you're right by Campville where all these murders have taken place. She's a sex worker. So his story, like, we tried to get the police reports from that. The police have kept the reports about the second guy involved in it that ran Frederica over. But since the other one was just ruled as an accident, those reports weren't saved, and so we'll never know what sort of interrogation, what sort of suspicion. It doesn't seem like much because the guy he's like exonerated within hours, and it doesn't seem like there was a lot of hard questions asked to that man, at least that we've been able to see. And the same with Alan.
And to be clear, John, the name that you used, Mr. Boyson, that's not the name of this landlord and employer. We're not naming him.
Yet.
He was the driver of that van in 1994. The landlord and employer that we are looking closely at, we're not naming him yet, but. We have strong suspicions.
Very strong suspicions. And then as we look into the police reports, this cross information, we have direct people telling us they believe this man is the murderer. We have our own suspicions just from reading all these the news accounts, like what's up with this guy. And then you find out that in 2010 the Connecticut State Police, the cold case unit, reopens the investigation into Karen Everett and Mildred Alvarado, and through the notes, as you can see, that this name is underlined, is like with a question mark. So this detective coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, 22 years after the murder, immediately zeroes in on this guy, and they collect his DNA and what, Bob?
Yeah, so quick backtrack. To this day, the police believe that whoever killed Karen Everett also killed Mildred Alvarado, because it was 3 months later, and their bodies were found 5 feet apart, rolled down a hill in Campville. So to this day, police believe if you solve one of those murders, you've solved the other. In looking at the police reports, this landlord and employer who had his hooks deeply into Karen Everett was treated throughout that investigation in 88 and 89 as a cooperating witness. They went to him...
Almost a character witness telling the story of Karen. His half-truth about his relationship with Karen.
If they had a question about one of her habits, like what she wore, what kind of earrings, they'd go to this. So he was seen as like the expert authority. They did take a polygraph test of him, but this was already after they were like asking him about other suspects and asking him to be helpful. And so I don't know how polygraph tests work, but I would think if police one day are like asking you about other suspects and asking you to be an expert witness and then polygraphing you the next day, I would think that might give you a lot of confidence, to present yourself as not a suspect. But that I'm not sure that. But they never
and the
really
polygraphs are inadmissible in court. That's not a that's not a be-all and end-all. It's sort of a guiding light. So there's been so many problems with them, and we don't even know exactly what happened with that polygraph. But you went and found out that this reopening this investigation in 2010, this detective was zeroing in on this man, and they collected his DNA, and then as you're reading through the reports, you could see all the other, there'd been DNA collected about other individuals, and there was always a report that said, here's the results. So what happened with this collection of DNA?
Yeah, cold case detectives 22 years later are looking at all the notes, and they have all these questions about this landlord and employer. Why wasn't he looked at closely? What about the people who work for him? They had all these like red flags, basically questioning the original investigation and pointed questions. So they went back 22 years later and got a warrant for his DNA to do a buccal swab, which is, I think, cheek, a mouth cheek DNA swab. They collected it in 2010, and as I'm going through all these reports, there's no results for that DNA test, whereas for every other DNA test, there was. So and it was like the last piece of evidence. So there's an evidence list for all these crimes, and for the Karen Everett murder, they had 104 pieces of evidence, crime scene evidence and stuff from her apartment, and a suspect they had going through. This was a guy, a street John, who drove the streets of Grove Street in a pickup truck. So they had him as a suspect, and they took a lot of things from his truck. But the last piece of evidence was this DNA swab from the landlord employer, and there was no results from it. And so that was astounding. So we reached out to the Western District Major Crimes Squad.
Backing up on my end a bit is Bob basically spent probably weeks of his life reading all this, the thousands and thousands of police reports that we obtained from the Connecticut State Police. And he created a document that we were going to share with the Connecticut State Police to try to get them, to motivate them to actually ask the question, did you test this man's DNA? And if not, please do so, because it seemed like your analogy was like a hanging Chad, just like laying there. They collected his DNA, and then there's radio silence from that point, from 2010 for 13 years. There's not a thing that's happened. So they collected the DNA, but did they process it? And was it found inconclusive? Did it exonerate the man? What was the situation? So we produced this report, or Bob produced this report, and with great assistance from my dear friend Dave Howard, who also worked at the Observer for many years. He collaborated with us and tightened the whole thing down with a set of outside eyes and ears, and boiled Bob's 40-page report down to a few pages, just with the intent to motivate the Western District Major Crime Squad to find out if that DNA was tested. And so Bob emailed the report and our request to Sergeant Hazen at the Western Major District Crime Squad, and that was, I think, in early November, or in November sometime. And so a little bit of time went by, and Bob is itching for an answer, and I said, just give it a little time. It's like he's got to figure this out. And he acknowledged that he had seen that too, that there was DNA collected, and he had said in his message to you it's fairly improbable they would have collected it and not tested it. And so maybe a couple weeks ago, Bob reached out to Sergeant Hazen again. What's going on with this? Did you follow through? Has his DNA been tested? And the response back is clearly it had not been tested, because now it's being tested right this moment. So they collected his DNA, this individual 13 years ago, 14 years ago, and probably didn't test it. And so now that doesn't make the man guilty yet, but all the suspicions we have from reading police reports and getting direct information from the public and information from the police reports, the media reports, and just storytelling. You put it together, and there's a motive. That he's lying all over the place about his relationship with this woman. He's covering his tracks with all kinds of. He's taking this, first strike at trying to control what the story is, and now the other story is much darker and sinister. And so now here it is. It's January 2024. I had to think about that one for a moment, and we're now waiting. The Connecticut police are our top suspect in the first murder here. Is we don't have the proof yet, but now the law enforcement botched the handling of his DNA. And so now we're waiting for the results. So as we keep pushing at this, it just keeps taking unexpected turns. And thankfully, Sergeant Hazen has been very open with us. We met with him a year ago. He said he encourages us to keep asking questions, and he ultimately gave the green light for us to dig through this. He acknowledged that they haven't tested that DNA for 13 years, and now it's going through the process. But when Bob, when Bob and I were having breakfast this morning, we were talking about this same man. His DNA was collected by the Waterbury Police Department in conjunction with the murder of Elizabeth Graywatts, and it was not a match. There was DNA found on Elizabeth, and it was not this man. And Bob came up with some a terrific observation about that, and why don't you share that, Bob?
Yeah. In both cases, this landlord and employer had these women in apartments in his business for. We know in Karen Everett's case, from June to October before her death, as calling it a captive sex slave is the way I'm looking at it. So he had ready access to her, and we've interviewed his niece, and we've interviewed another sex worker who he had a relationship, and they said he was a man who, when he wanted sex, he wanted it, and he would be upset if he didn't get it, because in his own mind it was bought and paid for. And so the idea that these murders may have occurred, right after a sexual encounter, as you might think that they, a street John picking up a woman in his truck, he was having ongoing sexual relationships with these women. So the idea that we had was that there may not be his DNA on it, that he may have just exploded in a rage over how much money she was costing him and how unavailable she had become as she was getting arrested. And
they're having sex with other men.
And they're having...
Which he was jealous. It says in some of the reporting you've done in the police reports is that he thought that they were his possessions. And so the DNA not on Elizabeth Graywatts is he would see her every day. He'd go to, like, she was living in the back of 69 Linden Street. He had an office in the building, and the only other person in the building was her doing custodial work for basically just giving her some money, and she was the captured sex slave of him. He finds her, the first one to find her, and he again is like Mr. another, kind of excessive talker about the people and about these individuals and trying to control the narrative. So at this point, there's no legal reason why we can't name this guy. He's now dead. So he died 15 months ago. So I had to look all this stuff up. As you can't slander a dead person, so we could legitimately just say his name right now. And I'm holding back from that because we don't have the proof yet. It's just that just this improbable investigation and all this research has brought us to the point where getting these thousands of pages of documents, it's revealed that the law enforcement for the state of Connecticut has collected his DNA and not processed it. So they apparently do have DNA from the body of Karen Everett that they can try and match it with. And even if it doesn't match, it doesn't exonerate anybody either. It's because the theory too is that it wasn't about sex; it was about power and control. And he had these women under his spell. They were reliant on him for their day-to-day existence. So this man has presented himself fraudulently to the media and was really living a pretty sinister life.
Double life.
A double life, as he's married. And
he was an usher in church, I might add.
Yeah, well, it's crazy. So we have a few minutes left, Bob, and if you look at this extraordinary twists and turns of our investigation into the Campville murders beginning in 1993 to now, what are some thoughts that you have about it?
The trajectory of it is really kind of extraordinary. For us to have gone out on the streets and meet Frederica Spinola, and her dying 18 months later, we knew her, so I feel we have skin in the game. I mean, I think anytime a journalist is writing about someone, a murder case, and they're trying to find justice, but having a personal connection, and we only talked to her one night and it was 15 minutes, but I think I speak for both of us. We'll never forget her. That encounter was very, very personal. So and sadly, we're not going to get the answer, I don't think, to her murder, which